Nigeria's President Tinubu has announced the creation of the Federal Ministry of Livestock Development in a move expected to end the lingering clashes between pastoralists and farmers. Meanwhile, the government has introduced a 150-day duty-free import window for food commodities as part of strategies to address the food crisis in the country. Kola Masha CEO Babban Gona joins me now to assess the impact of these moves and the country's journey to food security. Kola, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Let's start with your initial thoughts on this latest development in the agri sector, creation of a livestock ministry, and to your understanding how this could potentially work on the ground.
Well, I think, fundamentally, I think it's great that the government is recognizing the importance of addressing concerns between farmers and herders and some of the clashes that have triggered some of the violence that we've seen and insecurity in the country. So I think it's great that they have a level of focus. I'm slightly concerned about creating an entirely separate ministry due to the fact that it may actually inhibit collaboration between farmers and livestock sector, being that they can have a holistic plan within one particular ministry. But it is a step forward in terms of focus in that area.
Before now, there have been conversations in terms of solutions to, the lingering clashes between nomadic herders and farmers was the issue of ranching. And supporting farmers, herders in that regard. What are your thoughts on that? You're quite right about concerns around creating a whole ministry when we do have the Ministry of Agri on the one side, and then but just share your thoughts on the issue of ranching that has been preferred as a solution, time and time again.
Well, I think there have been pilot projects that have demonstrated that ranching can be a good solution. The key to making that work is ensuring that the ranches, once they're set up, have the appropriate infrastructure and support to actually encourage herders to actually want to reside within those ranches. I think oftentimes the ranches that have been set up have lacked that key infrastructure, particularly around access to water for their herds, and ensuring that they're able to have access to all the necessary support products and services to ensure that their farms are able to be highly productive.
Right. Let's move on to another development, and that's the 150-day duty-free import window for certain food items, also announced by the federal government. The government says, the borders, land and air, won't be open for more than this period, and they believe, the government believes that this is a sufficient amount of time to bring in a significant amount of commodities such as maize, husk, brown rice, wheat, cowpeas, and the other food items on the list. What are your thoughts, and to what extent does this help the farmers?
Well, I think fundamentally, I think at the end of the day, the solution is becoming self-sufficient and focusing on improving yields to farmers by increasing access to finance to buy the quantity and quality of inputs, increase productivity. But the reality is that those types of interventions do take time to bear fruit. And so I think one thing that I do appreciate about this initiative is the fact that it's very time bound, right? 150 days, targeting this window of time, July, August, September, which is oftentimes actually the peak period for food prices ahead of the new harvest that usually comes in starting October, November, December. So I think the key is going to be to see that it actually, they do follow the plan to ensure that it is time bound, because at the end of the day, unless you're able to provide some level of protection to the agriculture sector, it's hard to see the sector reach the level of productivity it needs to become, for the whole industry to become self-sufficient and the country to become self-sufficient.
Well, absolutely. That is very important. But let's talk about the 2 trillion naira stabilization plan announced by the president to reflate the economy. Out of that amount, 500 billion naira is earmarked for the agriculture sector. Talk to us, this kind of amount, to your mind, of what would you suggest in terms of a first move in terms of how this money can be effectively deployed to the agriculture sector? What would you recommend?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's great to see that there are initiatives around increasing access to finance in the sector. It's the critical lever to see the the increase in productivity that we need. I think the key is to think about it in a way that you're able to use the smallest amount of resources to create the largest amount of gain. One of the key challenges that I see with initiatives from the government is that they tend to focus on providing low-cost capital. Fundamentally, that is subsidized capital. It creates two problems there. The first is that it does actually create the opportunity and incentive for corruption, right? Because fundamentally, you're borrowing money at 10% when you can go and take that funds and put it in a fixed deposit at 15% and make a 5% return risk-free. So the reality, though, is that it also crowds out the private sector because other commercial entities that can provide subsidized capital can compete with that. I think what has worked very successfully in other markets is when the government leverages its balance sheet, as opposed to providing direct capital, subsidized capital, to utilize that capital to create guarantee funds, other mechanisms. Secondly, I think one of the best ones is a second loss guarantee fund that can actually crowd in the private sector, because the quantum of capital that's needed is tremendous. To support the Nigerian agriculture sector, we have 80 million hectares of land. That's going to be $80 billion in financing. 500 billion naira sounds like a lot of money, but in reality, it's less than 1% of what is actually required to really create impact across the sector.
Well, that's quite interesting. Quite interesting that you should point that out. Some analysts have said that this is knee-jerk reaction. We're just, addressing the symptoms of a bigger, maybe a bigger problem or a cocktail of problems, as it were, within the industry. You've talked about crowding out the private sector. Can there be a situation where, both can work side by side, financial aid from the government and private sector on the other hand?
100%. I think if you look at models like, for example, the U.S. Farm Credit System, right, the government basically leverages effectively a guarantee program to enable the private sector to raise low-cost capital off the public debt markets. And they raise over $200 billion a year that way. And it basically is a synergistic way that government can actually crowd in more capital. And that's a similar model that's used in many, many different markets.
All right, Kola, we'll leave it there. Of course, I will be keeping an eye on this one and see how it plays out. Thank you for your time today, as always. Kola Masha, CEO of Babban Gona.